Hey, good morning, everyone. This is Anoop Nair with IPP, and today we'll be talking about process start events as a part of our continuing IPP open bar session. I believe this is session number 5, and we'll follow the usual protocol, so I'll try to cover the topics that we need to in the first 30 minutes of our call, and then we'll leave the last 15 minutes or so for Q&As. If you would, I'd request you to kindly put your phones on mute, just in case there is background noise on any line, just so that we can continue smoothly with the call. Excellent. So the topic that we want to cover for today is process start events, which is essentially going to describe different ways that processes can be started in the Infinity Process Portal. The details of today's session, including the WebEx recording and additional information, will be posted on the IPP Open Bar Training wiki page as per our usual processes. So I've already created a solution with the models that we'll be using for today's session. The links for these will also be available on the Open Bar Training wiki page. Let's get into it right away. Let's go ahead and open the model that we want to use for today. What we want to look at essentially is what are the different mechanisms that we have to start processes in the portal. So some of these you actually have already seen in previous sessions, but may not have directly connected the dots as to what was actually going on behind the scenes. So let's go ahead and start create a process. So let's call this our manual start process. Okay. The first thing we want to do is go ahead and assign the participant to the swim lane, as you've seen in the previous session as well. So in this case, let's keep it simple. We'll just go ahead and keep it as administrator. Okay. And then you've done this before. You've gone ahead and created a start event on the process. So if I go ahead and drop the start event here, go ahead and give it a particular name. Now, if you don't have any other attributes set for this symbol, the start event itself, and this is what you may have seen in previous sessions, what you're really creating is what is called a manual trigger. What does that mean? So a manual trigger essentially means that this particular process can be triggered by a user manually, either using the IPP process portals itself or using the APIs. So all I did was drag the start event from the toolbar onto the canvas. I really don't even need to set any additional properties on the trigger itself. By default, the implementation for this particular start event is the manual trigger. Let's go ahead and add a follow-up activity to this particular manual trigger, just so that we can confirm that the process is indeed getting started. Call it manual get name. We'll create a simple primitive data that you've probably seen before called name, and we'll have this data on our canvas, and we'll go ahead and connect that to the activity. And we'll actually make this an input and output mapping. Just so that we can avoid some typing, I'll go ahead and put in some default value for our data. And what we have at this point is a simple one-step process that accepts or sets a value called name, a simple primitive, and the process can be started via a manual trigger that is via a user in the portals. Let's see how this looks like in the runtime. I already have the real model that you'll be using as a part of the solution template as well, already deployed to a runtime instance. So we can go in directly to the runtime instance and have a look at what this looks like. So here's my runtime instance. Let me go ahead and log in with the default credentials. And as soon as I log in, you'll see that in the launch panel for startable processes in the left, the process that we just created should show up. Give it a second for it to log in. And there we go. So under the My Startable Processes launch panel, you see the manual start process. For now, just ignore this other process. We'll come to that in a later part of the session. You see a tooltip providing the description that we have on the process itself. And if I click on it, it simply triggers the first activity of this process. You see manual get name is triggered, and the input field for getting or setting the name is available, and I can now work on this activity. Okay, so nothing super exciting as far as manual triggers are concerned. There's really just essentially a simple mechanism for the user to be able to start processes via the IPP portals or via the API, and probably one of the simplest ones used for regular day-to-day testing when you're designing your own processes. Obviously, depending on the default participant that you have for the swim lane that the trigger is in, you can control who is actually starting the processes. So if the default participant for the swim lane is some other role or organization other than administrator, then users having that role or organization as one of their grants would be able to start the processes, whereas other users would not. So you automatically get access control to start processes appropriately as well via the manual trigger. Okay? So that was the first and simplest way to start a process. Let's move on and look at another way to start a process. So sometimes you may need to start a process via automated means, as in via a timer mechanism. So let's say you have a process that needs to be executed periodically every 5 minutes, and you want a new instance of this process to be triggered every 5 minutes without any user intervention at all. And let's see how you might go about doing that. So again, let's go ahead and create a new process. Let's call this timer start. We'll go ahead and drop in the same start event again. This time we'll call this timer trigger. But when we go in, we'll go in and change the event class dropdown in the property page for start event. So all we did was we selected start event from the symbol from the canvas. In the event class, we'll now, instead of none, we'll pick timer. And once and you notice that the symbol immediately changes to a timer trigger symbol, indicating that it's enabled. And then we can set additional properties for this timer trigger by getting into the implementation property page. Over here, we can say this is a timer event. And once we do that, we get additional information about this timer event. So we can set, the first thing we can set obviously is the repeat interval. You can choose both the actual duration as well as the units. So let's say we want this to execute every 5 minutes. And we want this to be done just 10 times. And you can set a slight delay between each occurrence as well. And let's go ahead and set up follow-up activity to this event. And then I can do the same thing. Let's just go ahead and set some property for this first activity. Okay, so real simple. I just have a simple timer trigger that executes every 5 minutes, 10 times, I don't have any additional delay between each occurrence. Then I have a simple follow-up activity after the trigger itself. Let's see how this looks like in the runtime. So I had already deployed this the same model in the solution instance on IOD. So we should already be able to see an existing instance, or actually two instances of the timer review name process. And in fact, I can see that they were triggered by the system. There's no individual who actually started these processes manually. They're directly available and started by the system. I can also see the same information in the administration perspective in the process overview page. And I can see that the timer processes were started at certain intervals, and depending on what the settings were on the timer trigger itself. Okay. So the timer trigger essentially is a second means to start processes, one which does not require any user intervention, and one that can be automatically triggered at recurring intervals of time. Okay, so let's look yet another means, and this time we want to create or start a process, but instead of using the portals or an automated timer, we'd rather use an incoming document. So this happens quite often, as you might imagine, in the enterprise. You have a letter coming in, which might be an application for a new account or some other documentation. And based on incoming documentation, we would like to start a new process. And what we really would like to do is the ability to scan this document that came into the mailroom of the enterprise, and then take this document and start the process with this document attached to it. Let's see how we go about doing that. So again, over here, I'm going to create a third process. It's called a scan start. Again, for simplicity, we'll just keep administrator. Go ahead and put our favorite start event on the canvas. This time it's a scan trigger. Let's go in on the event class. Now, remember, none is for manual trigger, timer is for timer trigger, and now we're going to go into the special one that says message. So this is a message event. In our case, it's going to be a scan message, and we can actually set that property on the event implementation page. You notice you see a bunch of additional events that have now shown up in the dropdown because I picked the message as my event. I'm going to pick scan. Now this dropdown is interesting. It says, where should the scan document itself be stored? Scan documents can either be stored in document data, which is something that you saw during the document modeling session a couple weeks ago. In our case, what we'll do is we'll actually go into this process called scan start, and we can set on the process, we can enable process attachments. So there is a checkbox on the process definition page. It looks like a little paperclip on the process symbol. I can say enable process attachments. And what this is doing is simply saying that this process can support additional attachments to be attached to it, additional documents. If I go back to my scan trigger now, in the drop-down for scan documents, I can now say that any documents that are captured or acquired by the scan trigger will go into the process attachments data object. Okay. This drop-down will show additional document type data as well. So if I have additional data of type document, those will also show up in this drop-down. I could use those instead. And you could have some advanced use cases where you want to type each document separately. So you have a loan application document or a driver's license document, and you want to keep each of these separate instead of adding all these into this generic process attachments bucket. And you could do it way as well. So let's take the simple approach. We'll just put everything into process attachments, and we'll just keep a simple follow-up activity, just like what we have done in the past. And we can call this review application. And now we'll take the name field. We want some information about the user's name to be captured over here. Okay. And since the document that we're looking at is a process attachment, we should see that as well. Now, once I deploy this model, to be able to trigger this scan process, you would need the IPP scan client. A link to the IPP scan client is provided on the OpenBar wiki page. So if you scroll down the page and you look at the session for today, you'll notice that the installation package for IPP scan or Infinity scan and the directions on how to run it are available in the additional information section. Okay? So for now, let's go back to the process. I already have a solution instance deployed with this model. I'm going to just quickly bring up the scan login page. You should be able to see that on your screen. Let me go ahead and log in. One note over here, if you create your own solution instances and would like to use scan against those solution instances, find the advanced settings panel on the login page. And there are two pieces of information that you need to change. The first one is the partition field needs to point to the partition ID or the tenant ID for your solution instance. That's the first change. And the second one is, similarly on the web services URL parameter, the partition ID needs to be the partition ID of your tenant. Once you set this the first time, these will remain. If you use the defaults that are available in the zip file that's on the wiki page, those will connect to the solution instance that I already have deployed. So that should work as well. Okay. So let's go ahead and log in. It should pull up the main page for the scan application. Now, I probably will not spend too much time getting into the scan application itself. That, to be honest, that itself could warrant a complete OpenBar session. I probably will. But now let's look at the main aspects. Now, obviously, most of us probably don't have scanners available ready to go on our desktops. So there is a test mode available in the application wherein I can import images directly from your local disk instead of going via a scanner. So let's use that option for now. So I'm going to say import images, and I can pick any TIFF image, single page or multi-page. I'm going to pick this TIFF image on my machine. It's going to simulate a scan. What it's doing, obviously, is simply importing the TIFF image. This image has 2 pages associated with it. You can see those over here. There's several operations you could do in the scan client as far as deleting acquired images, moving pages up and down, image rotations, etc. We don't need to get into those for this session. The key thing over here, you notice that the process that had a scan trigger associated with it shows up in the process dropdown. And that's the key part. So you see scan start was one of the processes that shows up in the dropdown. The document slot into which this document will be stored, which is process attachments, also shows up in that list. Okay. Once this is done, all I simply need to do is click on the submit button, and I could either submit the current document or a batch. In my case, I just have one single document. I'm simply going to pick the entire batch. And once it's submitted, if you want to review the status of where the submitted job is, just click on this last job pending icon, and you'll see the status of the job show up. And there you go. You see that the job that was just submitted for 1 document and 2 pages was successfully submitted, and a process called with OID 1323 was created. Okay. There's lots more, obviously, that you can do with the scan client, and I've also linked to the scan documentation as a part of the additional information on the OpenBar wiki page. Okay, so let's get back to our tenant, and let's see what this means from user interface and the portals to verify if our document truly did come in. I'm simply going to go back to my workflow execution perspective in the portal. There you go. And you notice that I now have an activity sitting in the scan review application step, which was just started a few seconds ago. I can click on scan review application. And in addition to my name field, notice that my document, which was just scanned, opens up automatically in another view. And clicking on the document, I can now see the document that was scanned and acquired in via the IPP scan client. Okay, so what the scan trigger provides is a really simple means to acquire images via the IPP scan client and start processes with these, and the processes themselves would obviously have the documents that were scanned in available either as document data or as process attachments. Okay, so we looked at the manual trigger, the timer trigger, and the scan trigger. Let's see what other means we have to start processes. So let's look at a means to monitor an email mailbox so that we can start a new process anytime a new mail hits this mailbox. And you might imagine a pretty common use case for this might be that you have a support request mailbox, and anytime a new email hits that box, you want to start a new IPP process with all the information contained in that email available to that IPP process. So let's see how we'll do that. So let's go ahead and create a new process. We'll call this email start. Again, from the event class dropdown of the start event, I'll pick message. But this time on the implementation page, instead of picking scan event, I'll actually pick email event. And as soon as I pick email event, you'll see all the options related to an email event show up. So let's go through them real quick. The protocol that I want to use to access the mailbox, POP3 versus IMAP. So POP3, the address for the mailbox, so whatever the address might be. The port, the name of the account I want to use, the password, and the timeout settings. Then I can say only unseen emails or unread emails need to be popped from that box, and then you can optionally even delete those emails from that box once they have been popped. Okay. A couple of important notes over here. So the firstly, on the Infinity on Demand cloud environment, there are restrictions in place for outbound access to some of these sites. You may not be, or rather you will not be able to test against Gmail or Hotmail on the Infinity on Demand environment. However, you should be able to test for these if you have a local mail server locally, or if you have a local LM setup, lifecycle management setup, locally available, and you want to test the email trigger from there. Okay, which is why the solution template that I have does not include the email trigger in it right now. Okay? The next important thing you want to do once you get the email into the process, you want to get information from that email, the mail body, the mail content, and the subject into the process. So how is that done? So we go over to the parameters tab, On the parameters tab, we set up additional parameters. So let's say we want one for the body. We need to create a quick primitive data for it. Let's call this email body. While we're here, let's go ahead and create the other ones we need as well. So email subject and email from. And the way this works is, I can pick email body as the data for the parameter over here. The way this works is the information about the subject and the from information are provided via the underlying technology, and we'll talk about in a moment. We're using something called Apache Camel as the enterprise integration framework under the hood over here. It provides these via so-called headers in fields called subject and from. So these actually need to be named exactly as subject and from. And then I can set the subject to that data, and I can say that the body of the email should go into the body object. And if we were to execute this, and if I had access to the server from the Infinity On Demand environment, any incoming email to that mailbox, the body would go into the body data, subject would go into the subject data, and the from would go into the from data, and I would then be able to use these throughout my process flow. Okay. A colleague of mine, Vikas, who probably is on the call as well, had implemented this with another email box that we did have access to from the Infinity On Demand environment. I can quickly show you how that looks. So let's go into another tenant that is monitoring the support.ipp@infinity.com mailbox, and we'll try to send it an email message and see if it comes through correctly. So we'll log into this other tenant that is monitoring support.ipp@infinity.com. While we do that, we're going to send across a test email to that email address, support.ipp@infinity.com. Go ahead and send it out. I have 3 items in my book list. While we wait for the incoming one to be captured, you can see that the existing activities that were triggered as a part of that email trigger. I'll quickly show you the information that was triggered on previous instances. You notice that the body was captured in the previous instance, the subject line was captured, and so was the from address of the sender. And like I said, you could test this quite easily in your local setup as well if you have lifecycle management installed and have access to those mailboxes. In fact, you can see right now, a second ago, we get this new activity in 6558, and if I go into it, the body, the subject, and the from of the email I just sent across were captured correctly. Okay, great. So that was the email trigger. So now let's look at probably the last one, and I'll spend just a couple of minutes on this before we switch to question and answers. The last one is probably the most powerful, and I am going to get into a little bit of technical detail on this one because configuring it does require some knowledge of the underlying technology. like I said, we are using something called Apache Camel for the um, under the hood for as the enterprise integration framework on the IPP side. It's an Apache project. And there's a lot of documentation available online as well. And this provides what are called several connectors to connect to different technologies. So in fact, even the email connector that you look at right now under the hood is actually using Apache Camel. What we do expose to the end user is a generic Camel endpoint as well. And what that allows you to do is connect to other connectors that Camel provides and do some pretty powerful stuff with a little bit of coding, if you will, or configuration in the properties tab for the trigger. So let's see what we can do here. So I'm going to create a new process. Actually, I think in the interest of time, since we have a couple minutes over time already, let me show this to you on a process that I already have. A colleague of mine from the IPP enabling team, Ragul, helped me set this example up yesterday to demonstrate something really simple that can be done via a Camel endpoint. So here is my actual process. It's called generic Camel start. And on it, I have our favorite start event already. So let's wait for the screen to load over here. There you go. You see the start event for the event class is still message. However, if I get into implementations, you'll notice that the event implementation instead of email, file, or scan is actually a generic Camel route event. And here is where the configuration aspect actually comes in. So what we're saying is we're setting up a Camel route. Anyone that sends a message to this endpoint, IPP open bar session 5, will trigger this particular Camel route. And as a response, it will simply forward it on to the next one, which is simply the next activity in the process flow. So all we're doing is a single, or rather two statements, one indicating the name of this endpoint, which is IPP open bar session 5, and then where we want to send the message from here, which is the to endpoint, which is simply the next activity in the flow, which is what IPP:direct actually means. I can take any parameters that came in to this particular endpoint. So in my case, I want to accept a parameter called name, and I can simply capture that name, and it will simply flow through to the next activity in my process. Now, to start such a process, I have in the solution template model that you'll see a tester process. And in this tester process, which is startable via the portals, I get the name in the first activity and then simply invoke another application. And if I look at the details of this application, this is a generic Camel endpoint application. And in this generic Camel endpoint application, in the configuration section, it's configured as a send, which means it will send the request on to the next consumer in the queue. Here, it's simply, and this is the key aspect over here in the producer route, it says that send this message on to direct:IPP open bar session 5. And you can try this if you use the solution template from the open bar session. If you start the Camel Start Tester app from the My Startable Processes launch panel, what will happen is as soon as it reaches the second activity, because this application invokes the IPP open bar session 5 endpoint, it will start a new process for generic Camel start. Okay, I mean, if we can try that real quickly over here as well. Here we go. For some reason it is not letting me switch my perspective over here. Quickly going to log out and log back in. Okay. And what I'm going to do is from my launch panel on the left, I'll select generic camel application tester, and then we'll see how it internally triggers the other process from a process. So this is a useful pattern if you'd like to trigger other processes from a calling process. Here is the generic camel start tester. I'll simply complete the first activity, setting the name. And then I don't see anything immediately on the UI, but if I were to go to my process overview page on the administration perspective, I can actually see that one of the processes that came across is, in fact, you can see it in my work list as well. I see an activity from the generic camel process show up in my work list, which means that my other process was triggered. Okay. You can look at this in the process history, and this is a generic camel start process. So the start tester process triggered the start process internally via a camel application endpoint. Okay. Finally, before we close the session and go to Q&A, the other aspects you probably would like to look into are also the file events, which let you monitor arbitrary disk endpoints. So again, from the triggers page, you would pick message, but pick file endpoint instead. And what you can then do is you monitor a folder on your machine for incoming files, and then there are several settings available to actually set what these what you want to do with these files. So just real quick, if you go into the trigger itself, you can set the implementation of the trigger to a file event, and then you can say which directory you're watching, which file names you're watching. Do you want to do a recursive lookup into that folder, and so on and so forth. And there's quite a bit of documentation available on this in the IPP docs as well. Again, this one is a little bit difficult to test in the cloud environment, but you should be able to test this quite easily in your local environments if you choose to. One final note, and that is there is a known issue in the current IPP 7.3x release, and that is if you already have a start event on your canvas set to a particular type, be it a file event or a scan event, if you try to change it to another type, you see unnecessary validation warnings on the UI. So the easiest way around that for now in the 7.3.1 release is simply to delete the start event and create a new start event in case you want to change the type of the start event. Okay? And anytime you create any of these camel type start events, one thing you do need to note, and this is done in my model already, but in the on the model property page, you'll notice in the configuration variables section, there are two configuration variables created automatically, the camel trigger username and the camel trigger password. Those need to be specified. If not, you'll get deployment errors if you try to deploy your model. Okay. I think I've considerably exceeded my time over here, so maybe I'll just go over to you guys for any questions on start events.
Hi, Anup.
Okay.
Yeah, I have a question regarding the timer trigger. Okay.
Yes.
Say I have a process which I want to kick off at 8 a.m. every day, and I want to run it after 30 minutes each till 5 p.m. For that day. So can I model something like that using the timer trigger?
I think probably, and I would request the enablers to keep me straight over here. I think the native timer trigger probably will not be as helpful here. However, I think you should be able to use the generic camel endpoint, which we briefly saw. And there is a mode, and I think this is specified in our documentation as well, to use the cron-based approach on the generic camel endpoint. So in which case you can actually specify a cron tab expression in the generic camel endpoint, and then I think you should be able to achieve a more specific time-oriented way of triggering processes. Andreas or any of the enablers, any comments on that?
That's correct what you said. So exactly that the native timer would not support cron jobs, but by using the generic trigger, you could use for example quad to define your cron jobs as trigger. Correct.
Thanks, Andreas.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Any other questions? Okay. I guess we did cover quite a bit in the session. So, of course, if there are any questions as you try to either consume the solution template via the links provided on the wiki, don't hesitate to send us an email either on the IPP enabling team or myself, and we'll surely respond back to the question. Thank you, everyone, for your time, and we'll see you next week.
The conference is ending. Goodbye.